It happened a few years ago when I was still in college and had a passion for exploring abandoned places. I grew up in a small town in rural Texas, where stories about haunted places were common. I was always skeptical of these stories but fascinated by the atmosphere of those locations. That's why, when my friends dared me to spend a night in the old Oakwood Psychiatric Hospital, I didn't think twice. Oakwood had been shut down in the 80s following reports of patient mistreatment. Since then, the place had been abandoned, feeding urban legends about restless spirits and nighttime screams. It was an October night, and the air was cold and damp when I arrived at the hospital. The red brick building loomed against the dark sky, its broken windows looking like empty eyes watching me. I swallowed hard, feeling a knot in my stomach, but forced myself to press on. The main entrance was locked, but I found a broken window on the ground floor. As I climbed in, the smell of mildew hit me like a punch. I turned on my flashlight, the beam revealing long, dark hallways. "You got this, Nathan," I muttered to myself, trying to calm my nerves. I started exploring the first floor. The empty rooms still held traces of their original purpose: rusty beds, abandoned wheelchairs, papers scattered on the floor. In one of the rooms, I found a broken mirror. For a second, I could have sworn I saw a face that wasn't mine reflected in it. I blinked quickly, and the image was gone. "Just your imagination," I told myself, but my heart was racing. As I moved through the hallways, I started hearing strange sounds. At first, I thought they were just the usual noises of an old building, but soon I realized there was something more. It was like someone was whispering, too low to make out the words, but loud enough to unsettle me. I reached a staircase leading to the second floor. As I climbed, I heard a creak behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. My breathing was growing heavy, and I could feel the cold sweat running down my back. On the second floor, I found what looked like an old treatment room. Rusty medical equipment was still scattered around. That's when I heard a distant scream, filled with anguish. I froze, my whole body trembling. "It's not real," I repeated to myself. "It can't be real." But then I heard it again, closer this time. It was a scream that seemed decades old, laden with pain and despair. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Suddenly, I felt a shift in the air. The temperature dropped significantly, and I could see my own breath. The shadows around me seemed to come to life, moving in impossible ways. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure. It was just for a moment, but I could make out the silhouette of a man wearing a stained white coat. When I turned fully, there was nothing there. At that moment, all my skepticism vanished. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, down the stairs and through the hallways toward the exit. As I ran, I heard voices calling to me, screams echoing through the walls, and the sound of footsteps following me. I finally found the window. I'd entered through and threw myself out, hitting the hard ground. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Since that night, my life has never been the same. I have frequent nightmares about that place. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night feeling like I'm being watched. In quiet moments, I swear I can hear those whispers again. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was stress, the darkness playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I know what I experienced that night was real. Something drove me out of that hospital, and I fear that one day, when I least expect it, that presence I felt at Oakwood will finally catch up to me. If you are enjoying it, please consider subscribing and clicking the like button to support my channel. It was just another night on the job. As a long-haul trucker, I'm used to driving through the darkness with only my headlights and the occasional passing car to keep me company. But what happened on that stretch of Highway 69 in Oklahoma changed everything I thought I knew about reality. I'd been on the road for about 14 hours, making my way from Dallas to Kansas City. The clock on my dashboard read to 17 a.m. when I first noticed the figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But as I got closer, I could clearly see a man standing there, his thumb out in the universal sign for a ride. Now, I know better than to pick up hitchhikers. It's one of the first rules of trucking. But something about this guy made me slow down. Maybe it was the late hour, or the fact that we were miles from anywhere. Whatever it was, I found myself pulling over. As I opened the passenger door, I got a better look at him. He was an older guy, probably in his 60s, with a weathered face and clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. "Where are you headed?" I asked. "Muskogee," he replied, his voice gravelly and low. "Much obliged for the ride." I nodded, and he climbed in. As we started rolling again, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling in my gut. The cab of my truck suddenly felt colder, and I noticed my breath fogging up slightly. I chalked it up to the AC working overtime and tried to focus on the road. "So, what brings you out here in the middle of the night?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He was quiet for a moment before answering. "Just trying to get home. Been away for a long time." Something in his tone made me glance over at him. That's when I noticed his hands. They were pale, almost translucent in the dim light of the cab. And they seemed to be fading. I blinked hard, thinking it must be my exhaustion playing tricks on me. When I looked again, his hands seemed normal. But now that I was really looking at him, other things started to seem off. His clothes, which I had thought were just old and dirty, now appeared to be from another era entirely. And there was something about the way the passing lights hit him, or rather, didn't hit him. It was as if the light was passing through him. My heart started racing, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the chill in the air. I tried to keep my eyes on the road, but I couldn't help stealing glances at my passenger. With each look, he seemed less and less substantial. Suddenly, he turned to me. His eyes, which had seemed normal before, now had a strange, glowing quality to them. "This is my stop," he said, his voice sounding distant and hollow. Before I could react, he simply disappeared. One moment he was there, and the next, the passenger seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt on the empty highway. My hands were shaking as I turned on the cabin lights and searched the seat where he had been sitting. There was nothing there. No indentation in the seat, no trace that anyone had been sitting there at all. But as I leaned closer, I noticed something on the floor. It was an old faded photograph. I picked it up with trembling fingers. The photo showed a man, the same man who had been in my truck, standing in front of an old house. The back of the photo had a date written on it, June 15th, 1952. And below that, in faded ink, was written, "Home at last." I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that photograph. Eventually, I managed to start driving again, my mind reeling from what had just happened. When I reached the next truck stop, I asked some of the local drivers about the stretch of road I'd been on. That's when I learned about the legend of the Muskogee ghost. Apparently, back in the 1950s, a man had been murdered on that very stretch of highway while trying to hitchhike home. Since then, there had been dozens of reports of a ghostly hitchhiker appearing to drivers in the dead of night. I've been driving trucks for over 20 years, and I've always prided myself on being a rational, level-headed guy. But that night shook me to my core. I still drive that route sometimes, and every time I pass that spot, I feel a chill run down my spine. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see a figure standing on the side of the road, thumb out, waiting for a ride home. I've always been a creature of habit, especially when it comes to unwinding after a long day at work. There's something about the steady stream of hot water cascading over my body that seems to wash away the stress and tension of the day. It's been my go-to relaxation method for years, a simple pleasure I've always taken for granted. That is, until that Friday night in July when everything changed. It had been an unusually grueling week at the office. Budget cuts, layoffs, and a looming deadline for a major project had left me mentally and physically drained. To make matters worse, my husband, Tom, was away on a business trip, leaving me to fend for myself in our eerily quiet suburban home. As I pulled into the driveway that evening, all I could think about was my upcoming date with the shower. I trudged up the stairs, shedding my work clothes as I went. The house was uncomfortably warm. The air conditioner had been acting up lately, and the July heat was oppressive. I cranked up the AC and headed straight for the bathroom, my sanctuary. The cool tiles felt good under my bare feet as I stepped into the shower stall. I turned the faucet, sighing with relief as the water hit my skin. I closed my eyes, tilting my face up into the spray, feeling the day's tensions begin to melt away. The white noise of the water was soothing, almost hypnotic. That's when I heard it. At first, it was so faint, I thought I must have imagined it a low, indistinct sound barely audible over the rush of water. I opened my eyes, blinking away droplets, and looked around the foggy shower stall. Nothing seemed out of place. Shaking my head, I closed my eyes again, determined to relax. But there it was again, a little louder this time. It sounded almost like a whisper. My heart rate picked up a notch. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the pipes or the wind outside. But deep down, I knew it was neither of those things. And then, clear as day, I heard it. Molly. My eyes flew open, my heart leaping into my throat. Someone or something had just whispered my name. I stood frozen, the warm water still beating down on me as I strained my ears. The bathroom was silent except for the sound of the shower. It's just your imagination, I told myself firmly. You're tired, stressed. Your mind is playing tricks on you. But even as I thought this, goosebumps rose on my arms. I forced myself to continue my shower, lathering shampoo into my hair with trembling hands. And then, just as I was starting to calm down, it came again. Molly, Molly, the voice was soft, almost melodic. It didn't sound threatening, but that somehow made it even more terrifying. It was as if whoever or whatever was speaking knew me, was trying to get my attention. I couldn't take it anymore. I frantically rinsed the shampoo from my hair and shut off the water, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The sudden silence was deafening. I stood there, dripping and shivering despite the warmth of the bathroom, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. But there was nothing, no whispers, no strange sounds, just the quiet drip of water from the shower head. With shaking hands, I grabbed a towel and wrapped it around myself, feeling absurdly like it could shield me from whatever unseen presence was in the room. I scanned the bathroom, looking for anything out of place, any sign of what could have caused those whispers. Everything looked normal. The frosted window was closed. The mirror was fogged up. My clothes were still in a heap on the floor where I'd left them. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every creak and groan of the house settling. I even called Tom, making up an excuse about a weird noise just to hear his voice. He suggested it might be the old pipes acting up again, and I let him believe that was it. How could I explain what I'd really heard? In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself it had been my imagination, a product of stress and exhaustion. But every time I stepped into the shower, I felt a knot form in my stomach. The feeling of being watched, of some unseen presence lurking just out of sight, never quite went away. I've never been able to enjoy a shower the same way since that night. I keep them short now, always alert, always listening. And sometimes, when the water is running and the bathroom is full of steam, I could swear I hear something, a faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing. To this day, I wonder who or what was calling my name that night, and why me? These questions haunt me, especially in those quiet moments when I'm alone in the bathroom, the sound of running water filling my ears. I may never know the answers, but one thing's for certain: I'll never take a relaxing shower for granted again. I've always been a night owl, especially since I started working from home as a freelance artist in Seattle. The quiet hours of the night are when my creativity really flows. But lately, something's been off. It started about a week ago when I first noticed my neighbor's cat perched on the fence between our yards. At first, I didn't think much of it. Cats are nocturnal creatures after all. But as the nights went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that this cat was different. Its eyes seemed to glow unnaturally in the dark, and it never moved. Not even a twitch of its tail. Just those piercing yellow eyes, always fixed on my studio window. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my work. But every time I glanced up, there it was. Watching. Waiting. I started to feel uneasy in my own home, constantly checking over my shoulder. Even during the day, I'd catch glimpses of something dark moving in my peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. One night, unable to concentrate, I decided to confront the cat. I stepped out into my backyard, the cool Seattle mist clinging to my skin. Shoo! I called out, waving my arms. But the cat didn't budge. It just stared, unblinking. As I approached the fence, a chill ran down my spine. The cat's eyes seemed to glow brighter, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a human-like intelligence behind them. Suddenly, my porch light flickered and went out. In that instant of darkness, I heard a soft thud, as if something had landed on the grass behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing. When I turned back to the fence, the cat was gone. Shaken, I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. As I settled back into my studio, I noticed something on my desk that made my blood run cold. There, right next to my sketch pad, was a single black cat hair. The cat's nightly vigil continued, and my nerves were fraying. I knew I had to do something, so I decided to talk to my neighbor. Maybe he could shed some light on his pet's strange behavior. The next afternoon, I spotted Mr. Johnson working in his front yard. I walked over, trying to appear casual. "Hey there, Mr. Johnson," I called out, waving. He looked up from his gardening, wiping sweat from his brow. "Oh, hello there. Nice day, isn't it?" I nodded, mustering a smile. "Sure is. Say, I wanted to ask you about your cat." Mr. Johnson's brow furrowed. "My cat? Yeah, the black one. I've seen it on the fence at night." I was wondering if he cut me off, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, but I don't have a cat. Never have, actually. I'm allergic." My blood ran cold. "But I've seen it. Every night for the past week. A black cat, sitting on your fence, staring at my window." Mr. Johnson's expression changed from confusion to concern. "Are you feeling all right? Maybe you've been working too hard." I mumbled something about lack of sleep and quickly excused myself. My mind was reeling. If it wasn't Mr. Johnson's cat, then what had I been seeing? That night, I sat in my studio, lights off, waiting. Sure enough, as the clock struck midnight, I saw it. The cat was there, perched on the fence, its yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. But this time, knowing what I knew, fear gripped me like never before. I watched, paralyzed, as the cat's form seemed to shimmer and distort. Its eyes grew larger, more human-like. And then, in a motion that defied nature, its head turned a full 180 degrees to stare directly at me. A scream caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, knocking over my easel. Paints clattered to the floor, and in that split second of chaos, I lost sight of the fence. When I looked back, the cat was gone. I haven't slept since that night. I can feel eyes on me constantly, even in broad daylight. Sometimes I catch glimpses of a dark shape in mirrors or reflective surfaces. And always, there's that sense of waiting, of something biding its time. My name's Kate, and I was just looking to escape the city with a few friends when we decided to rent this quaint cabin nestled in the mountains. It seemed perfect, secluded, peaceful, a chance to disconnect from our busy lives. If only we had known the dark secrets that place held. From the moment we arrived, something felt off. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and an eerie silence blanketed the surrounding forest. As we unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. More than once, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. That first night, we gathered around the fireplace, sharing stories and laughter. But as the hours wore on, a chill crept into the room that had nothing to do with the temperature. Objects seemed to shift when we weren't looking. A book would be on a different shelf, a chair slightly out of place. We laughed it off, blaming our imaginations and the unfamiliar setting. But then the whispers started. At first, they were so faint, I thought I was imagining them. Hushed voices carried on the wind, words just beyond comprehension. They grew louder as the night progressed, and I wasn't the only one who heard them. My friend Sarah swore she heard someone calling her name from the woods, but when we looked outside, there was nothing but darkness. As we tried to sleep, the cabin came alive with unexplainable noises. Footsteps creaked above us, though we knew the attic was empty. Chains rattled in the walls, and somewhere in the distance, I could have sworn I heard music like an old-time celebration echoing through the trees. The next morning, we woke to find strange, intricate patterns drawn in the dust covering the mantel. None of us had touched it, let alone created such elaborate designs. And the mirror in the bathroom, I'll never forget the moment I saw those handprints appear, as if pressed from the other side of the glass. We tried to rationalize it all, to find logical explanations. But as the day wore on, the events became harder to dismiss. Objects would vanish, only to reappear in impossible places. The scent of lavender would suddenly fill a room, so strong it was almost suffocating, before disappearing just as quickly. It was when we found the old photographs that true terror set in. Hidden in a drawer, they showed groups of people in front of our cabin, spanning decades. In each photo, one person's face was scratched out. And with growing horror, we realized these must be the missing people. We'd heard rumors about, the ones who had come to this cabin and never returned. That night, as a storm raged outside, we huddled together in the living room, too afraid to sleep. The shadows seemed to move on their own, taking shapes that were almost human, but not quite. And in the flashes of lightning, I swear I saw faces pressed against the windows, their eyes hollow and pleading. We tried to leave, but our cars wouldn't start. The phones had no signal. We were trapped, our minds racing with panic and confusion. The cabin, once a quaint retreat, now felt like a prison. As the night wore on, the intensity of the supernatural presence seemed to grow. The whispers became more distinct, and I could swear I heard my name being called from different corners of the house. Sarah, always the skeptic of our group, tried to maintain a rational explanation. "It's just the wind," she kept saying, her voice trembling. "Old houses make weird noises." But even she couldn't explain away what happened next. As we sat huddled together, the temperature in the room plummeted. Our breaths came out in visible puffs, and frost began to form on the windows from the inside. The fire in the fireplace, which had been roaring moments before, suddenly went out, plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black, I felt something brush against my arm. It wasn't the touch of any of my friends. It was ice cold and sent shivers down my spine. I let out a scream, fumbling for my phone to use as a light. As the weak glow illuminated the room, I saw everyone's faces etched with terror. "Did you feel that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. They all nodded, too scared to speak. That's when we noticed the scratches. Long, deep marks had appeared on the wooden floor, as if something had been dragged across it. They led to the cellar door, which we had found locked earlier and had been unable to open. Now it stood ajar, a yawning black void beyond it. We debated what to do. Part of me wanted to barricade ourselves in the living room and wait for dawn. But another part, driven by a morbid curiosity and the desperate need for answers, wanted to investigate. In the end, our need to understand overpowered our fear. With shaking hands, I led the way down the creaky stairs into the cellar, our phone lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The cellar was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, layers of dust covering everything. But one area stood out a clear space in the center of the room, where the dust had been disturbed. As we approached, our lights revealed something that made my blood run cold. A large pentagram was drawn on the floor, surrounded by candles and strange symbols. In the center lay an old leather-bound book. With trembling fingers, I picked it up and opened it. It was a journal dating back to the 1920s. As I skimmed through the pages, a horrifying story unfolded. The cabin had been built by a man obsessed with communicating with the dead. He had performed rituals, trying to open a gateway to the other side. According to the final entries, he had succeeded, but at a terrible cost. The last page was stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The final words sent chills down my spine. They're coming through. God help us all. As I read those words aloud, the candles around the pentagram suddenly burst into flame. The cellar door slammed shut, and an unearthly wail filled the air. The walls seemed to pulse, and in the flickering candlelight, I saw shapes forming translucent, human-like figures reaching out towards us. What happened next is a blur of terror and confusion. Somehow, we managed to break free, to run up the stairs and out of the cabin. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road, where a passing truck driver found us, hysterical and babbling about ghosts and rituals. The authorities investigated, of course. They found the pentagram, the journal, even the old photographs. But they couldn't explain the handprints on the mirror that disappeared before their eyes, or the whispering voices they heard when no one was around. Thank you for listening. Now try to sleep.